subscribe and tap the bell. Twice a day, we bring you the real words of the Stoics, not paraphrased, not softened. According to a tradition recorded by the early writer Tertullian, a victorious Roman general riding through the streets during his triumph, the highest honor Rome could give a living man, crowds cheering, an entire army marching behind him, had a slave standing just behind him in the chariot with one job. Whispering, over and over, into the general's ear, "Remember, you are mortal." At the exact moment a Roman citizen received the largest possible confirmation of his own importance, Rome built in a mechanism to undercut it. Memento Mori. Remember death. The detail is almost too neat to be entirely true as usually told, and modern historians point out that Tertullian, writing centuries after the practice supposedly ended, may have been describing a moral lesson more than a literal daily ritual. But the underlying instinct behind the story is verifiably, thoroughly Roman, and it shows up constantly in writers we know weren't exaggerating for effect, because they were writing private letters and notebooks never meant for an audience at all. Whether every detail of that triumph tradition is historically precise is debated by scholars today, but the Stoics didn't need the legend to make the same point directly, in their own words, without any theatrical staging required. Seneca opens his essay on the shortness of life, translated here by Aubrey Stewart, with a direct challenge to how people actually spend their days. It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it. His argument isn't that death arrives too early. It's that most people live as though it won't arrive at all, and organize their entire lives around that false assumption. Seneca pushes further into the specific way this shows up. You are living as if destined to live forever, your own frailty never occurs to you. People postpone the actual living, the honest conversation, the changed career, the reconciliation, to some later chapter they've quietly assumed is guaranteed to arrive. Seneca's point is that nothing in a human life was ever guaranteed to arrive, and pretending otherwise is the single largest thief of the time people claim not to have enough of. Marcus Aurelius runs a version of the same exercise from the other direction, not urgency about the future, but perspective on the past. He reminds himself, in his private notebook, of the sheer volume of human beings who lived, mattered enormously to themselves and the people around them, and are now entirely gone from memory, emperors, generals, entire dynasties, reduced in his own writing to a handful of names half remembered by historians. He wasn't writing this to depress himself. He was writing it to loosen his own grip on exactly the kind of permanence a reigning emperor is most tempted to assume he's earned. Marcus takes the leveling even further in one of the notebook's darker passages. He reminds himself that Alexander the Great, who conquered most of the known world by his early 30s, and the mule driver who once worked for Alexander's army, both ended up in exactly the same condition after death. Matter returned to the same natural process, regardless of which one of them had commanded empires and which one had led pack animals. Written by a reigning emperor, about the most famous conqueror in his civilization's history, the comparison is doing real work. If death erases the distance between an emperor and a mule driver, then the distance itself was never the thing worth organizing a life around in the first place. This is where Memento Mori and premeditatio malorum, the Stoics' rehearsal of hardship exercise, actually diverge, even though people sometimes collapse the two together. Premeditatio malorum rehearses a specific bad outcome so it won't arrive as a shock. Memento Mori is broader and, in a strange way, more useful day to day. It's not about rehearsing your death specifically, but about letting the plain fact of your mortality reorganize what you spend today's hours doing. Not because today might be the last one. Because treating every day as though it might be the last one is the only realistic way to stop postponing the parts of life that actually matter to you. Epictetus applied the same reminder to smaller, daily losses, not just the final one. He taught his students to hold every possession and every relationship the way a traveler holds a room at an inn, cared for, appreciated, but never mistaken for something owned outright. Memento Mori is the same idea scaled up to the largest possession a person has, their own remaining time, which was never actually owned outright either, only ever on loan, for an unknown and unnegotiable number of years. None of this reads to the Stoics as morbid. Seneca is explicit that his goal in constantly returning to death isn't gloom, its urgency pointed in a useful direction, toward living now, rather than toward some improved future version of a life that keeps getting deferred. While we are postponing, life speeds by, he writes elsewhere in the same essay. The postponement is the actual enemy in his account. Death is just the deadline that makes the postponement finally visible for what it is. There's a plain, practical version of this you can actually run at the end of a day, the way Seneca reportedly reviewed his own conduct each night before sleep, not a dramatic confrontation with mortality, just an honest question. What did you postpone today that you'd regret leaving unfinished if this turned out, without warning, to be the stretch of days you'd been given? Most days the honest answer is nothing urgent. Occasionally it isn't, and that occasional answer is the entire value of asking in the first place, a call worth making, a conversation worth having, a decision worth finally closing instead of leaving open for a future version of yourself that was never actually guaranteed to show up. The habit has resurfaced in recent years as a physical object, a coin, a bracelet, a small skull carved into a ring, worn as a daily prompt. The object is new. The instinct behind it is the same one that put a slave in a Roman general's chariot 2,000 years ago, and the same one Seneca wrote down in a letter to a friend he knew, like everyone else, wouldn't have unlimited time to read it. Remember you are mortal, not as a threat, but as the one fact reliable enough to finally get you moving on everything you've been quietly saving for later, a general in a chariot, an emperor with a notebook, and a person scrolling a phone at midnight 2,000 years later, all being told, in the end, the exact same unwelcome, useful thing, in whatever form each century found convenient to deliver it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and the Stoics they trained, straight from the source, twice a day.